Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few moments. Going to let everyone file on in from the waiting room. While we're waiting, for those who are comfortable doing so, feel free in the chat to let us know where you're joining us from tonight. Certainly no obligation, but let Deirdre and I know where you're watching from tonight if you're comfortable doing so. And we will get started in about 15 seconds. Just a note, we are recording tonight's presentation. Only Deirdre and myself and her slideshow presentation will be recorded. Deirdre and I cannot see you or hear you. You won't be recorded, I promise. Okay, so why don't we get started? I'm expecting another at least dozen or so, but we'll get started. So my name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services here at the Tewksbury Public Library, coming to you tonight from my home, but want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring tonight's program and sponsoring all our programs here at the library for adults, teens, and kids. We're a very active programming library, and it's thanks in large part to the Friends and their generosity. I anticipate this program lasting approximately an hour or so. We might go a little less or a little more. Deirdre is going to have a presentation. She's going to present uninterrupted, and then we'll do a Q&A at the very end. If you have questions for Deirdre, feel free to type those into the Q&A box. And if you have any comments, feel free to type those into the chat box, and we'll address everything at the end of the presentation. Feel free to type as we go, or feel free to wait and type at the end, but we'll get to everything at the end. So tonight's presentation is entitled How the COVID-19 Pandemic Has Affected Our Sleep and Dreams. Have you experienced weird, terrifying, unsettling dreams that stick with you long into the next day? Harvard Medical School researcher and psychologist Deirdre Barrett, PhD, is a dream specialist and author of the brand new book, Pandemic Dreams. She collected 9,000 dream surveys and in their retelling offers insightful commentary about what those dreams reveal about the pandemic experience. Thank you for joining us for this fascinating look at how COVID-19 has infiltrated every aspect of our lives, including our sleep. And I do want to acknowledge and thank Deirdre for allowing us to be flexible and change the date. We were supposed to come to you a couple of weeks ago, but then James Patterson got in the way. So we appreciate the flexibility. And again, I want to thank the Friends for their sponsorship. So everyone on the line live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Deirdre for joining us here tonight. And Deirdre, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Nice to be here. So I've studied dreams in some past crises and traumas. I collected dreams after 9/11, and I was in Kuwait right after the first Gulf War ended and collected dreams about that event. And some I didn't collect but did analyze were from a World War II Nazi POW camp full of British soldiers. And one of them had collected 500 dreams from his fellow prisoners, which he meant to do a dissertation on, but he died in the camp, sadly. So the dreams had just sat for decades until I analyzed those. So when the pandemic hit, it just seemed like a very obvious question to me to ask people what they were dreaming about the pandemic and to look at how it resembled and differed from all this data that I and other researchers have on past crises. So I got the survey up on March 23rd. And from the very start, there were lots and lots of dreams that were basically about getting COVID. And a lot of these were quite literal. The dreamer would dream that they were coughing, that they were having trouble breathing, that they were spiking a fever, and they would think I must be coming down with COVID. And then there were some that were just a mild dreamlike variation on that. Like one woman dreamed that she looked down at her stomach and saw blue stripes. And in the dream, she remembered that this was supposed to be the first sign of a COVID infection and knew she had COVID from the blue stripes. So lots of ones where they explicitly dream that they've gotten COVID. But then also I saw lots of the same metaphors that I had after other crises. Natural disasters commonly stand in for any other kind of terrible event. I saw these after 9/11, and the Kuwaitis dreamed them during the occupation. So things like tsunamis coming at the dreamers, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires breaking out. There were lots of those that I was familiar with from other crises. But then there were some metaphors that were quite unique to COVID itself. And the biggest cluster of these was bug attacks. And it wasn't any particular kind of bug. It was usually large quantities of whatever bug it was, but it could be swarms of bees or hornets or flies, or it could be cockroaches racing toward the dreamer, or masses of wriggling worms. And I think this is partly because dreams often do a sort of pun-like thing with representing a concept with a pun-like image. And I think the fact that we say I'm coming down with a bug to mean getting a virus has something to do with how common this dream was. But also I think that related to that, that just lots of little things that cumulatively could harm or kill you make a pretty obvious metaphor for the COVID virus. So that was the biggest distinctive cluster, but a smaller but equally unique to this event one was invisible monsters. I see some monsters standing in for 9/11 or Iraqis occupying your country, but not invisible monsters. So these were many fewer than the bug attacks, but they were still striking because, like I say, I hadn't seen a single one in the other samples. And they could just be that the person was outside and they knew there were invisible monsters that could grab them at any moment. But sometimes there were more details, like the person couldn't see the monsters in one case, but could hear their footsteps behind them. In another one, in a dimly lit building, they could see the shadows of the monsters on the walls, but they couldn't see the monster itself. And then in probably the most terrifying one, a woman was outside and she was with a group of people, and one by one of these friends would be knocked to the ground and they would begin to get these horrible wounds that looked like bite and claw wounds on them until they eventually bled to death. And then she knew that the monster could jump up to 6 feet between people. So as soon as it had killed one person, she would see another one fall down and start getting these wounds from the invisible attacker until that person died. And at the end of the dream, she realized that she was standing within 6 feet of the last person who'd been killed by the monster. And she felt this thing landing on her, even though she couldn't see it, and woke up in horror. But those I'm getting COVID and metaphors for it have not gone away even to this day, but they were the most dominant at the very start. And then as some of the secondary effects had been there for a while, people began to dream about things like isolation, quarantine, lockdown. And for that set of issues, there were really two main themes. The people that were isolating at home alone tended to have exaggerated scenarios of loneliness. They were being thrown in prison, often solitary confinement. There were some people who were stranded in space on a spaceship. And there was one that had to live on Mars, and one that was told they were getting a great honor, that they were being appointed to be the first one-person Mars colony. And when they said, no, I didn't volunteer for that, I don't want to go to Mars alone, it was like, no, it's great honor, but you have to. And they were sent off to Mars. So that's what the isolating alone people were dreaming. But then from people who were sheltering with their extended family or a lot of roommates, they tended to dream scenarios about crowding or lack of privacy. Like the whole neighborhood has moved into my house in one dream. The whole neighborhood is at the windows trying to move into my house in a similar one. One man couldn't walk through rooms in his house because there were so many cots set up everywhere from people who were temporarily housed there. A woman who was trying to use the toilet couldn't get the bathroom door shut because everybody's stuff was blocking the doorway, so she had no privacy in her own bathroom. So those were the most common when the most places had been locked down already for a few weeks. And then other secondary effects showed up in dreams too. Homeschooling dreams almost exclusively from mothers. One woman who really was homeschooling, her 10-year-old dreamed that the school messaged her and said that they were sending the child's entire class to her home and that she had to homeschool the whole class for the rest of the pandemic. And it's interesting that just dream sharing stirs up this empathy, because when you tell a dream like that to adults in general, but especially a group of mothers of school-age kids, there's all this nervous laughter, but then people start sharing their feelings about it, and really more quickly and intensely than if the same woman was just saying, I'm really overwhelmed by homeschooling. My kid doesn't listen to me like he would his teacher. I don't have any teacher's education. It's really difficult. She would get sympathy and, relating type responses, but the dream with its really vivid scenario seems to be a shortcut to that. And there were all kinds of dreams about financial woes, kind of exaggerating a scenario about what was happening on that front. And then as the pandemic moved along, there began to be some really different themes, especially last summer when a lot of places were reopening. People were going back to work for the first time. Sometimes by summer, there were a lot of dreams about scary workplaces. Sometimes it was fairly realistic. My coworkers all look pale and they're all coughing, and I think I'm going to catch COVID from them. And other times it was kind of bizarre, surreal things. They've put in this filthy carpet on the floor and it's wet, and they have a new rule that you have to take off your shoes and socks. So I'm walking across this disgusting carpet my first day back at work. And then more commonly last fall, when a lot of schools were back in person for the first time, there were all these bad back to school dreams. And I only collected from adults, so I didn't have kids' dreams, but lots of them were parents who dreamed of driving their kid up for the first day of fall classes after being homeschooled for months. And again, realistically, there would sometimes just none of the other kids are wearing their masks like they're supposed to. They're all coughing, but there would also be these fantastic scenarios. And one which was from a teacher, and I did have a lot of bad back to school dreams from teachers, but one was that at first she was starting to try to teach this class, and she just sort of heard spooky Halloween sound effect type sounds off and on. And then she saw these sort of ghoulish eyes peering out from a bookcase, and she'd keep trying to teach. And eventually ghouls who had come in and inhabited the school over the summer were chasing her down the hallway, trying to kill her. So lots of bad back to school dreams as lots of schools were first in session. And then a theme that has it existed from early on, but really changed over time is from March 23rd, I saw anxiety dreams about something wrong with masks from most of Asia, where they were being told to wear masks, and mostly were. I didn't see them in the US for several weeks because early on we were all being told that nobody but healthcare providers needed to wear masks, and they didn't do much, and we needed to scrub our surfaces. So briefly there were more dirty surface things, but those became less common. And at first there were a lot of other people don't have their masks on, but it became more and more about practicing it yourself. And people would have this, oops, I don't have my mask on dream, or my mask has slipped down, or my mask has fallen off. or just much more dreamlike ways that the mask turns into something else that's not going to work effectively as a mask. So I don't have my mask on. Has been there since, again, in the US a few weeks in and some other places from the start. But early on, for the first 6 months at least, these dreams were always fearful ones, where as soon as they realized they didn't have their mask, they panicked that they were going to get COVID and they tried to get away from people. And sometimes they covered their face to sort of make a makeshift COVID barriers they were trying to retreat. But gradually over time, the oops, I don't have my mask dreams, almost half of them are now accompanied not by fear and thinking about infection, but they're accompanied by this shame or embarrassment that you've forgotten this terribly important rule and what will people think of me. And now some of those people, if they cover their face, it's not to keep the virus away, it's so that people can't see that they're not wearing their mask. And that's become an increasingly large percentage of them as we get used to wearing our masks, and it is such a social norm. And it's kind of like it's replaced the classic I'm naked in public dream, where you're in a shopping mall and suddenly you realize you're stark naked, or you realize you're dressed except you forgot to put your trousers on, just varying degrees of not dressed. And now that seems to be represented by I'm in a shopping mall and oh my God, I realize I don't have my mask on. So that one has really changed over time. Healthcare workers, especially the ones in the emergency rooms and ICUs, are kind of in a category by themselves. The most typical dream for other people is an anxiety dream, not even a full-on nightmare in most cases, although certainly some of those examples that I told you were nightmares. But most nightmares are very scary dreams, and they happen in rapid eye movement sleep like the rest of dreams, and they're dreamlike in their content. But traumatic dreams happen across all sleep stages. They're somewhat more realistic than other nightmares. They can have dreamlike elements, but they're often pretty realistic, and they're generally reenacting a real terrible event that has recently happened to the person. And it may unfold just like it did in waking life, or it's something that almost happened but didn't actually awake, that they were afraid was about to happen, will actually happen in the dream. So from March 23rd, when the survey went up from Italy, I didn't have Chinese ones the first few days, but day one, I had some Italian submissions from healthcare workers, and they were having these horrible dreams that became really common in the US and Europe, other European countries later. Of the most typical one was they were trying to get a tube down someone's throat and their airway was too constricted and they couldn't pass the tube, or they had the tube in and they were trying to attach it to the respirator and the respirator was malfunctioning in some realistic way, or the respirator was turning into some device or creature rather than a respirator. But basically, even if it was bags of platelets or some other detail, it was there's a person or a whole room full of people dying in front of me, and it's my responsibility to save them, and I'm failing at it. Was kind of the standard nightmare for them. And really much more analogous to what people who barely got out of the lower levels of the towers in 9/11, or were the police or firemen who were called to that scene. Theirs looked much more like the really directly frontline traumatized, which is very different than sort of the general public that most of these are coming from. I also looked at men and women's dreams separately. And although I'd been doing this close read to pick out themes and other things, some things had not jumped out at me as much until I actually did the formal statistics. And although I had certainly noticed that most of those anxiety dreams about homeschooling were from women, I hadn't noticed some of the other differences. So men and women both had twice the level of anxiety as from a big sample of dreams I had from earlier, calmer pre-pandemic times. Anxiety was twice what it typically is in dreams. References to illness were twice what they generally are in dreams, and references to death were 3.5 times. And that was very similar for men and women. But for women only, sadness had doubled and anger was up by 1.5. And men's sadness and anger were just the same as usual. This text analysis program that I was using has 2 other categories that I thought were relevant, which are called biological processes and body references. And those were elevated for women, but not men. And they basically refer to body parts. I mean, just arm, leg, torso, genitals, head would score on body. But they also have some internal organs referenced, and biological processes is everything from eating to sex to, that's what biological processes is. So women dreamed more about those things. And I think that women were like more distressed in their dreams across the board, related to ways the pandemic has affected them more, that men and women are pretty equally likely to catch COVID, to die of COVID, to have bad cases of COVID. That's much more tied to age and some other variables. But women quit their jobs disproportionately when they didn't want to take care of children who were out of school. They were laid off involuntarily from jobs disproportionately more than men, because they occupy more of those really insecure job slots with no contract, where they can be fired overnight without being owed any severance pay. And men are likelier to have full-time jobs with a contract that either says you have to give 3 to 6 month notice before firing, or you have to give 6 months severance pay, or something that makes it less likely they'll get fired and not as catastrophic a happening if it does. And women do more of the nursing care of sick family members who aren't hospitalized. And then in the hospitals, they occupy more of the kind of low status positions that were having the most trouble getting good PPE early in the pandemic, when physicians tended to get much better than low-level nursing staff. So I think that that's why they have more of this, just all kinds of body stuff and sadness and anger, along with all the other bad things that they're both feeling. Then I've been talking only about negative dreams because the sample certainly was skewed toward the negative, but there were categories of positive dreams, and dreams about a cure for COVID was one category. It's a small set, but they've been there all along, and some of them are lightly plausible, that there's a antibody that's discovered in cat saliva that's going to cure it, sort of various chemical mumbo jumbo. Some are completely fantastic. Like there was one where somebody had discovered that if you took the shape of the spike proteins and you played musical notes that on a musical graph would be at those exact positions, that the music dictated by those could contain the COVID and trap the COVID under the musical notes. But then there was one extremely realistic that's come true, not as a cure, but as a detection method, which is one young man back in March, before this was being done or mentioned in the news, he dreamed that he was in a grocery store. It was actually the sort of late March, everybody's shopping, and we were afraid the grocery stores were going to shut down for a while. And he was doing his last minute COVID shopping, and he had his dog in the store with him. And the dog was periodically grabbing his pants leg and pulling him in certain directions. And at first he just tried to get the dog to stop, but then he realized that the dog was pulling him away from particular people, and that the dog must be able to smell who had COVID and who didn't. And he said that when he woke up, he remembered reading stories about dogs being able to sniff out cancer, and it seemed sort of plausible to him. But he didn't go the next step and suggest this to anybody who could do something with this. But lo and behold, soon there were stories in the news just 2-3 months later that some of the same labs that did the cancer sniffing were starting to test whether dogs could detect COVID. And they're now being used in the Finnish airports and a few other places because they're actually much more reliable than a temperature check as something for people to run past. Another category of positive dreams are what I'd call wish fulfillment ones, where people are in some crowded, happy social setting, and either it's explicitly the pandemic is over, so we can do this, or the pandemic just doesn't exist in this particular dream, but people were doing all the things that they weren't being allowed in waking life. And I did see these from just a couple weeks into lockdown. You began to see a few of these wish fulfillment dreams, but they weren't real common early on. And also they tended to be accompanied by the person waking up and saying that they felt a wave of sadness as soon as they were awake because they felt like they were being shown some past kind of event that they couldn't imagine when this would happen again. So they were sort of being tormented with these happy things that aren't. But about the time the vaccines were even announced as passing approval, before most people were getting them, I saw a big uptick in these dreams of crowded, happy settings. And they also strikingly became accompanied by the person saying that they woke up and they felt cheered up by the dream because they interpreted the dream as showing them the near future and what they were going to be doing again soon. And so the sort of identical sounding dream would make people sad early in the pandemic, and now almost always cheers people up. And actually within the last several weeks, they're occasionally accompanied by, and I really did this for the first time last week, but I was seeing them sort of like the happy version from the time the vaccine was approved. Then there are other even more utopian ones. In some, the pandemic is over and the world is just cooperating and people care about each other more and we've learned basic values. And then another big category is that the environment is cleaner. And some of these are just almost the same things you hear people remark on seeing in reality, that they're at the beach and the water looks cleaner, or dolphins are swimming closer to shore. But others were more fantastic. One woman had a whale had moved into her backyard swimming pool. It was as big as the pool, but it was happy splashing around there. And this was somehow they'd felt safe to come in because there was less human activity. But my favorite was this woman who walked outside for the first time after the pandemic was over in her dream, and looked up, and her phrase was, the whales had learned to fly. There were all these giant whales swooping like graceful blimps through the sky. And it was obviously just a wondrous, ideal dream. So I've also done a little bit of dream work with the same way you'd work with other dreams. And I just want to tell you about 3 approaches that are so simple that you could try the pared down version of these yourself.
It's dusk, a humid night, and the air just smells of guano. And then I happened upon Dean's one-trick pony, which was hopping that evening. I was pretty curious, and I stopped to ponder whether or not I should get a drink. I wondered if I could even get a seat, because it seemed to be pretty packed. As I got closer, a gust of wind blows through. There's a man in my peripheral vision. He just blows over. I'm like, whoa, what just happened? He's laying there quivering on the ground. But then I realized he is not human. All these figures I thought were people were just cardboard cutouts fluttering in the wind.
So, so that's a dream film commissioned by time.com. It's up at their website. And the dreamer, whose real dream that is, Andy, I was asked to do a little work. I was actually asked to interpret his dream because lots of people think the expert comes in and says, oh, this symbol means this. But when I sort of said, no, what you really do is kind of ask people some questions to draw out their own symbols, they were very open to that. So I'm definitely not telling you anything so personal that Andy doesn't want it out there, because it's in the filmmaker's write-up about the film on the time.com site, that we really got some interesting insights in just a fairly short interpretive conversation about that dream. I asked him about several elements, like the college street he was in, and he told me that he's out of college and living in a different city, but he has these kind of positive but very college-y associations to Austin, and that this was a street that he hung out on. But when I asked about tourist bars, he said that One Trick Pony bar was the only one he wouldn't have gone into because it was for the tourists. And well, what is a tourist bar? Well, it's something kind of superficial, and they try to look like everybody's having a good time, but actually nobody knows anybody. It's for show. And then I asked, well, what about cardboard cutouts? That was like the most striking, unusual element in the dream. And he kind of thought for a while, and he said, well, the only actual ones I can remember seeing are in the film Home Alone. It actually turns out to be Home Alone 2. But in Home Alone 2, which he didn't get the 2 in there right away, the kid is again left at home, but he's left at his uncle's townhouse in New York as his family takes off again. And in the scene with the cutouts, there are bad men who are at least going to kidnap him and possibly kill him, who are outside the house. And he needs for them not to realize he's alone. And so he finds these life-size cardboard cutouts, and he positions them in front of the windows, and even finds a way to slide them side to side a bit. So it looks from the outside like there's this big, lively party going on, because they can only see the silhouettes from the outside. So but when we even heard the phrase "Home Alone" in the midst of lockdown, that was pretty striking. And basically, Andy ended up saying that he was quite conscious of being lonely, but he hadn't been quite so conscious of the other elements that he associated with that scene, of sort of trying to fake that he was still having a decent social life and good time, and kind of fool others a little bit. And in the Home Alone film, it works, and the would-be kidnappers leave, but in his dream, the cardboard cutouts just blow away and don't work. So even though obviously these dreams are about COVID, that's a nice example of how you definitely get to some kind of more personal, more important stuff if you do a little interpretive work. And another thing, which was not really at all just me, I was on a group Dreamwork Zoom call, but it was another technique that also is a commonly used one, but a kind of its simple version can be done almost the moment you hear about it, which is kind of the opposite approach to just only asking the dreamer questions about, what might this mean? Tell me your associations to cardboard cutouts, and not intruding at all. This takes kind of the opposite approach to get at the dreamer's association, which is everybody in the group throws out all their own associations. for my dream, it might mean this, but you very much own that you're just giving your associations. You're not saying this means this for the dreamer. And so when we did a round of this dream was a New Zealand woman who was a healthcare worker, and her family was still all in New Zealand, but she had a nursing job in Australia. And it was dreamed like late last spring, start of the summer, like, months into the pandemic, but not real recently. And she had this dream where she was inside an abalone shell that was out in the ocean, and it was dark inside the shell, and also the ocean looked kind of dark and stormy, and she was very frightened and huddled in the shell. And then very gradually, she began to notice that it actually looked a little bit lighter outside, and the ocean was kind of calming down, and it did that very gradually till it was sunny and calm. And then the seal pup came along and started playing and right in front of the shell that she was still in. And so in response to that dream, about half the people in the group tended to give associations about the pandemic, that, the pandemic might make you want to crawl in your shell for protection, that the stormy seas might be what it felt like as the pandemic was approaching, and you're a nurse, no less. But that in both New Zealand, where she worried about her relatives, and in Australia, they were hit so much more lightly than almost anywhere else on the planet, that this relief that the ocean is calming down, it's not really as bad as it looked a little while ago, is something that people around the world wouldn't necessarily be dreaming, but that made a lot of sense if you're a New Zealand nurse working in Australia. You missed the storm for the most part. And that the playful seal pup sort of represented this, and it's even helping the environment. And then the other group gave interpretations that were much more personal. Well, my dream, being in my shell, might mean kind of shutting myself off socially, and dark and scary world out there might be sort of a fear of venturing out into the world. And the playful seal pup might be the playful side of myself, one person said, or the playful seal pup might be inviting you to come out of your shell and play with it, another person said. And what was really interesting was when she was then asked to comment, the final part of the process is see what of all these suggestions clicks for you. She endorsed both sets of those, but she said that she'd been completely aware of all of the COVID type interpretations of stormy sea and then lightening up, that felt like an obvious metaphor for how she'd experienced the pandemic change over time, but that she hadn't really thought about the personal parts. But now that she did, she would describe herself as a kind of a shy, reserved, hesitant person who maybe should get out in the world a little bit more than she did, and who had a playful side in her imagination that didn't get acted on very often. And so she felt like she got a lot more out of the second set of interpretations, even though she was endorsing the COVID linked ones as just as relevant. And then the last technique I want to mention is not interpretive, but the most common question I got through the pandemic was, I'm having so many anxiety dreams. I think I know what they're about. I don't want to interpret them. I want to make them go away. Is there any way you can make yourself stop having anxiety dreams? And no method is completely foolproof, but the best thing to try is, it's the opposite of just thinking, I don't want to have any more anxiety dreams, the famous don't think of a white bear and it pops to mind. You don't want to take that approach. You want to think about what you do want to dream about. And for some people, the emphasis is more on they want dreams that are very calming and peaceful because they're scared. But some other people wanted dreams that were kind of interesting and adventurous because they were bored to tears in lockdown. But it can be as simple as pick a person you'd like to visit with in your dreams, pick your favorite place that maybe you're going to go once this is all over on vacation. But it can also be just your all-time favorite specific dream that you'd like to have something like that again, or a category. Lots of people love flying dreams and want to have a flying dream tonight. So pick what you want to dream about and just state it as a simple phrase to yourself. Tonight, I want to dream about X. Tonight, I want to dream about X. And then it's equally important to pick a visual image that goes with it. And for something as simple as a person, you picture their face or an image of them full body or the place you want to be. But come up with a vivid visual image, because our dreams are so visual that often the visual request gets in even more powerfully than the verbal one. And if you absolutely don't relate to the phrase of imaging in your mind's eye, if that's just like if you're at the very low imagery end of the continuum, you may want to have a physical photo or some other object that would represent the dream on your night table as the last thing you see. What's better about holding the image internally is that you can do that even once your eyes are closed and you're starting to drift off to sleep. So tell yourself you want to dream about this. Image what you want to dream about. And in one study where I had people trying to dream on a chosen topic for a week, half of them had at least one dream on their chosen topic. But the half that failed at that task, a significant chunk of those were people that didn't recall dreams at all. And if the point is more to not have any anxiety dreams, then you've actually succeeded at that. Also, just falling asleep thinking of a very pleasant dream topic is kind of a nice way to fall asleep and gets rid of some of that sleep onset anxiety, kind of aside from whether you have the dream you've chosen or not. But you often, but not absolutely reliably will. So that's it for talking. And we have approximately 18 minutes for a Q&A. And I think Robert's already been reading through some of the questions that
That's right, Deirdre. So first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. We appreciate it. I would encourage folks, if you have any questions or comments for Deirdre, get them into the Q&A or get them into the chat. And we do have an ample amount of time here. We can go for another 15 minutes or so. First question is from an anonymous attendee. He or she asks, what purpose do traumatic dreams serve?
There is no general agreement on that. And I've certainly heard some of my colleagues talk about feeling like it's sort of a maladaptive part of our psyche. But my personal opinion is that it's I'm very much an evolutionary psychologist. So I think that anything that's not working well for us in modern day was nevertheless something that did work for us when we were in small tribes on the savannah, which is, 99.9% of human history and what our genes have really developed for. So things like that we crave sugar and fat, which is now so easy to get, you can easily eat way too much. Fruit was really scarce and was about the only thing that was sweet, and game was not as fatty and was harder to come by, and you found a few nuts, and they sort of were essential things that were rare that now we can just make huge wads of and do detrimental things with. So I think that the post-traumatic dreams kind of worked like that in olden times, that something bad that happened to you was likely to be something that could easily happen again. And that the point of post-traumatic dreams is to keep you scared and anxious about that thing possibly happening again. and that through most of human evolution, that was very adaptive, that if the tribe over the hill came and raided your village and killed some people and left, that they might easily come back soon and do something similar. Or if you were attacked by a certain kind of wild animal, you needed to watch out for that kind of wild animal in the future. So feeling like it just happened last night and being terrified that it will happen again, I think that is the point of why they're coded into our DNA. And that it's just like with so many of our instincts, it's very unfortunate that they've sort of become disconnected from our current lifestyle, and that, you know, if your house burns down, it can't burn down again. Someone who gets raped is not significantly likelier to be raped in the future than someone who never has. Someone who's been in an automobile accident, ditto. So I think that this thing that is now really a problem of it feels like it just happened. It keeps you feeling re-traumatized. It keeps you very anxious about it. It's a problem now, but I think it's probably really the evolutionary purpose of them.
Another anonymous attendee, perhaps the same one, wants to know, what was the most surprising thing you learned from writing your book?
I guess a couple of things pop out. One is the kind of unique categories. I mean, I did know all the ways they were going to resemble my other crisis dreams population. But I never would have said, oh, there'll be a lot of bug attack dreams. So the things I mentioned as being unique to the pandemic were one surprise. And then I was kind of embarrassed because I think of myself as a feminist, but I really thought that there would only be small gender differences and pretty much in the direction that the genders usually vary on dream content. And even though in reading them, I'd noticed the moms and the whole homeschooling, I had not just in the course of reading them realized how much more sadness and anger and body references. And when I went back and looked, I could really, oh yeah, that was a woman's dream. And some of the body reference ones were coming from things that happened much more to women, like it might just be a leg that's referenced, but the dream would be something like my roommate is staring at my platonic roommate is staring at my legs in this sort of creepy manner. And there has awake been reported more sexual abuse, both by partners, but also by non-partners that somebody is sheltered with. So I was surprised at how the pandemic forces pushed men and women's dreams a little further apart than their usual ones.
So it looks like that is it. Light night for questions. Let's plug your book though, Deirdre. Where can people buy a copy of Pandemic Dreams?
It's on Amazon is the easy place to get it, as a very inexpensive paperback or a Kindle. I never even went through the step of putting it out in hardback. Usually you have a hardback out for a year before you put a paperback out, but wanted this one out fast and cheap. So Amazon. Great. Pandemic Dreams.
And I'll make sure that the library buys a copy or two as well. So Deirdre, any last words before we wrap up a few minutes early?
No, just good luck to all of you. And I am happy to see more happy, optimistic dreams coming into the survey lately than has been true for most of the 1 year plus.
Great. Well, thank you, Deirdre, for giving us about an hour of your time tonight. We truly appreciate it. I want to thank everyone who did join us here live on Zoom, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of other viewers via YouTube on demand, so we'll look forward to that. And look for an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please fill it out and let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events. So thank you again so much. Thank you, Deirdre, and everyone have a great night.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.